And we should be live. Hello everyone, how is everybody doing? Let's see the chat. Oh, we've got 30 viewers. So today we're joined by Hassan. You should be audible, Hassan. Say hey.
Hello.
There we go, blowing my ears out. So, before we start, I just wanted to make it clear to some people who've been asking, because some people have complained about the massive amounts of ads that come onto the streams when they upload sometimes. It's because of the music that I use, and I don't have any control over it. I could switch over to public domain music, which I think I'll do in future, but if anybody has any access to public domain chant, that would be superb. That would be really useful. So, today we're going to be discussing the culture war and the clash of civilizations. Because it's something that comes up quite a lot, and I know you were saying to me yesterday, Hassan, that it wasn't necessarily a productive way of looking at things. So, if you want to elaborate.
No. Well, I mean, what we're discussing here is that there's a distinction between the war between mankind's attempt to align itself with logos, with reason, and, well, the opposite. And the war between separate civilizations, which are more or less oriented towards logos. Now, the thing is that what we see is that there is an identification, for example, with Islam as this other, this cultural other, this civilizational other. And one of the things that we often find ourselves doing because of this, rather than defining our faith according to its own positive values, according to our own authors, according to our own fathers, most important thing is the rejection of patristic morals in our modern society, including by people who are religious Catholics, is that you find that certain things that are no longer in common with modern Western culture, but which are in common between Islam and the patristic traditions, are viewed exclusively as other and even part of some kind of wider evil. And it's incredibly unproductive. And at the end of the day, how it causes us to view other people as other depreciates our understanding of the universal saving power of the passion, which is a very big problem. And this is something that I've frequently noticed, is that in the Eastern Christian communities in the Middle East, for example, they often treat the situation as a purely ethnic situation, as if it's not possible for their local Muslims to ever be brought back to the faith of their ancestors who apostatized from Catholicism, which is very, very sad. And this has been a recurring theme in my ongoing attempt to familiarize myself with the indigenous Christian communities of the Middle East. But this is again something that isn't confined to that region at all. It's something that you find in Western civilization among our traditional or religious Catholics, and it isn't something confined to the attitude towards Islam. It's something which belies a much deeper problem in our reasons for being religious and in the psyche of our spirituality.
Yeah, it needs to be for the sake of the religion itself, not for the sake of winning a culture war.
Our faith is a real personal relationship with goodness itself, who has revealed himself to indeed be a person and therefore in some way attainable by us, by his self-bestowal to us.
Sorry, I'm... Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, I had some problems there. Sorry, you were saying?
Yeah, I was saying that we need to view the faith as a personal relationship between us and God. And since all things are in God, with all things, with the good in all things, we need to understand ourselves as individuals who have a relationship with God and therefore with everything he loves. You can't presume to truly love God without loving everything he loves. And the fact that God keeps anything in existence is evidence of his love for it. So we have to be very careful in our attitude towards people of other groups and other civilizations, rather than seeing them as some other class of people whose redemption we are not to concern ourselves with, in a world where we are routinely exposed to people from all over the world on the internet, and now, for better or worse, wherever we are.
Yeah, we have to remember that because God is, of course, actus purus, the pure act, and his existence is his essence. Although we are not God, obviously, that would be pantheism, he sustains all things, including people of other groups. And so we must afford them with as close as we can mirror an imitation of God's love for them. We cannot make this about ethnic group fighting. It's very tempting to do that. You see it a lot online because people are obviously feeling very stressed. There are people who talk a lot about, the inter-ethnic violence, particularly that's going on in my own country, but also in many others. And so it's naturally going to lead to that sort of rhetoric. But the trouble is that isn't productive. Not it isn't progressive. I mean, it isn't. But It's not productive. But one thing I've also noticed thinking about this is that this embattlement comes out of an idea that we're some sort of minority, which in a statistical sense we are. But when Tertullian talks of the soul, he speaks of it as naturally Christian. And that means every single person from the worst pro-abortion doctor who's murdered thousands of children to the saintliest nun. And so, likewise, by virtue of that, the likeness and image as it's called in Genesis, we ought to afford that as well and not act as if we're an embattled minority as many people are apt to. And understandably so. It doesn't benefit us. Did St. Paul and the other apostles, quake in their boots because there was just 12 of them, or 13 of them? Did the embattled minorities under Islam cave when they started to be eclipsed in population? No. I mean, they did to an extent, as Hassan has pointed out. They certainly didn't capitulate. But no, there are people who have always and continue to spread the gospel. You know, Saint Ahmed the calligrapher. I know you're pretty fond of him, Hassan, for example.
Yeah, Ottoman convert.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Learned it off a Russian slave, from what I understand.
Yeah. I mean, we have a lot of things that you have to remember is that in the book of Sirach, a time when God, of course, only had direct rule over one people. In chapter 24, Christ speaks through Yashar ben Sirach, saying, "And I have stood in all the earth and in every people, and in every nation I have had the chief rule." Right? Every single people's true ruler is Christ. Every single person, every single soul is susceptible for salvation. And indeed, God has created every single rational soul of man that exists in order for them to be predestined to heaven. And our task as those who are aware of this reality is to help as many as we can in that direction. Now, of course, you have a first responsibility to your family and then to your community and your nation. Of course. However, whoever you're exposed to is somebody who God has willed permissively or actively for you to be exposed to. And for any man to look at somebody who God has put into proximity with them and say, "None of my business," is wrong. Absolutely wrong. Fulton Sheen talks about how we need to grow to such a point where even a person who we meet at a bus stop is very much potentially inspired towards conversion.
So stop sinning, guys.
We can't. Yeah. Well, that's the first one, right? But our orientation should be towards absolute love for everything loved by God. You cannot align your will with God's until you align your will with His will to love every single thing that He chooses to make exist. Because His choosing to make them exist is an act of love.
So, I think we're going to do this a little bit differently. If you guys want to stick questions in the chat and we will respond, that would be really good, because that can keep things flowing. I also want to talk a little bit about nationalism, because I have a feeling that Hassan and I disagree on it. Because someone's mentioned...
Probably, I think I'm more big on the theology of race than you are, and that's pretty much the main difference, is that I emphasize it more than you do. But that's, again, I'm somebody from a minority who is embattled from within and out, within somebody else's society, whereas you can understand that as you are still somewhat of a majority and this is your own homeland, that I could view you as having some kind of complacency towards the matter. I can't afford to do that, because I want my people to survive where they live.
I wouldn't call it complacency, I'd call it, I don't want to call it straight up despair, but, like I said in the other stream, I think we're basically getting exactly what we deserve. And I don't know...
But you can't assume that is annihilation. God gives the people what they deserve so that a remnant of them will repent and continue to people on.
Yeah, I know, but I'm not particularly up on the ethno-nationalism stuff, because at least from, as an ethnic majority, looking at the ethnic majority groups that are nationalist, I see a lot of unpleasant things flowing from them, and you and I both know that that's the case.
Yeah, I know that that's the case, but is that all of England? No. Is that the most significant part of England? No.
Is it the
I don't
people who
think
are
that it's
actively
significant.
nationalist? Is it the people who are actively nationalist? Yes.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm worried for, in 20 years, like, are my Catholic children going to be safe in a Catholic country, in a country which was founded as a nation built for the purpose of orienting its people towards heaven under St. Alfred the Great, who is my, as you know, my confirmation saint. How on earth could it be that, my grandchildren, my children and grandchildren could potentially see serious problems because of people who are supposed to be descended from that nation? Of course, not entirely. You could say to a large degree that the people of my sort of background have brought it on themselves in this country, to a large degree. But it's not entirely. A large degree of it comes from, frankly, brainwashing of people from my kind of background, from South Asia and from the Middle East, into a white progressive ideology. Ironically, what they call education.
Ideological colonialism. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's ironically what it is, and they won't admit it. And if you point it out to them, they get very short with you because they don't really know what to do.
Yeah, because they don't see that perspective. You see, one of the great things I think about, maybe not Black History Month, but the celebration of non-white authors, is that you can push a lot of really spicy stuff, right? Like,
Oh yeah.
Why would you worry about Ibram, whatever his name X is, the one who wrote anti-racist Baby, when you could be pushing St. Augustine, or St. Ephraim the Syrian, or St. Charles the Wanga, or somebody like that?
Yeah, African History Month, you have like St. Clement telling women to cover their faces.
Yeah, one thing you could do is you could start pushing the work of Cardinal Sarah. I mean, there's, like, you see, like, we understand. You see, the position that we're in, at least in a demographic sense, although all souls are Christian, very few, well, not very few, but few are. But we can play this off against them. We can use these months to push things that are intrinsically against their worldviews in such a subtle way that they won't even be aware of it. Right? For example, Jacques Derrida, he complains about the modern philosophy having reached its end because it doesn't make any sense after a certain point. Why not start tacitly pushing parts of a pre-Enlightenment philosophy in those months, under those guises, to push people more in the direction of a more authentic, non-Protestantized, non-quote-unquote enlightened Christianity?
Right, and it's not even, you say guys, but frankly, are there the greater part, in fact, much more than just saying the greater part of these people's histories are of value, people with values who overlap with ours. That's just the reality of it.
Yeah.
I mean, here's something that I've noticed as well is, and I've tried to get some support for this. Now I'm having to go through priests and do it myself. The idea of some kind of ecumenical relationship with this country's Muslims, to the end of putting out joint proposals on social values and joint agreements to work together against abortion, for example. Can you imagine what kind of strength we would be able to get on that single issue if we managed to galvanize Catholics and Britain's Muslim population against abortion? We would just have gained over 7% of the country's support.
Oh, more like 15, I reckon, because you'd also have a bunch of Protestants who would probably rally to that.
That's true, but there are a lot of people who simply don't want to have anything to do with them. And at that point, like, do these children matter to you that much if your distaste for a group of people is going to prevent you from working together with them to save their lives.
Yeah, and I mean, like, even on an
Yeah,
intellectual...
okay, well, I don't want to be a dhimmi, Heraeth. That's pretty terrible.
Right, so, continuing off that, likewise, talking to the secular people, which I think is more my suit, because that's my background. Do you know that these people don't have particularly strong arguments? Hassan and I have just spent the last hour and a half arguing with a bunch of pro-abort women, and they're just getting creamed. Because they don't know how to react. Right?
Yeah, I mean, most of them have never actually come across the classical arguments for the rational soul, or for like a thing's nature being unchanged by its like non-contingent properties. They don't know anything about that.
Well, yeah, they're freaking out.
You could tell some of them were starting to hesitate in their views as well.
Oh yeah, they were really freaking out when we suggested that maybe we should actually control our sexual appetites. Could you see that? Yeah, like, you can really get them to You can really get them to think if you are not only persuasively argumentative with them, but also you don't resort to insults, which I see a lot, particularly on Catholic Twitter. Right? That it's a disgrace. It's a disgrace what I'm seeing on Catholic Twitter. What I indeed participated in myself when I was on there. A lot of people lack charity. A lot of people have this bunker mentality. Like, we're behaving like an embattled minority that's trying to strut around as if we have power, when really we should get out of that mentality and help the people around us without getting, uppity.
I think and I've been shilling this a lot lately, but one of the greatest things that you guys can do is that you really need to read into what the church has to say about the role of the laity. You can read the section of Lumen Gentium from the Second Vatican Council on the laity.
I did a stream on it.
Yeah, sure. We can do that.
No, I did a stream on it.
Oh, you did? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I remember now. There's a load of stuff that the church specifically prescribes the laity to do. There are texts that go through this. There is a letter on the pastoral conversion of the parish for the sake of the evangelization of the culture. Now remember that the point of the parish is not supposed to be the end point of the distribution of the sacraments and of grace. It's not supposed to. The parish community isn't there for us. It's there for us to give what we have been given. Now, Catholic social teaching is very clear. Everything we privately own, including the grace in our souls, is not something that really belongs to us, but something that we have been given for the sake of our proper administration of it to others, whoever are within our responsibility. Now, the parish has its responsibility the sanctification of the entire community around it. Now, does that mean that if somebody doesn't want to be baptized or hasn't been convinced yet, that there's nothing we can do? No, not at all. Not at all. There's so many things we can do to reach out to people, to show them what our similarities and differences really are, to build a better rapport, to, here's a serious question. Think about this. The people who live in the neighborhood around your Catholic church who aren't Catholic, if you were to ask them, do you think the Catholic Church is there for you? I don't think that many people would say yes. Because the local parish, frankly, doesn't do much to get to know locals on a personal level and to get involved in community life and to figure out what individuals' problems are and go family by family and try to help everyone, which was what we used to do in the early church. And that's what won us so many converts.
Also, I want to respond to this in relation to abortion. What the 21st Reaction says, it's not about arguments, they only want pleasure and status and power, not reason. Well, you see, I've found when you start providing very strong arguments against abortion, there are a number of different camps of people who are pro-choice. And I can say this as somebody who was once pro-choice before I knew what abortion was properly. There are the type that kind of panic, and they have a realization. I know you've seen this personally, Hassan, and I think we've just seen it in the argument we were having. There's the type that harden their hearts and go the other way, which you can't do anything about. And then there are the kind that are kind of curious, like you saw people Googling rational ensoulment when we were mentioning it. Right? So, ultimately, much of the secular culture is about pleasure. But really, a lot of people don't know any alternative. A lot of them have been born into families where they haven't had a father that's there, and the girlfriends and the boyfriends of their parents have changed in and out like, pairs of clothes. And so you've got to remember that. And if you provide them an alternative, something that is loving, because love is above our understanding. God is love and God is incomprehensible. But it still is something that provokes people to no end, much more than than saying God is just, much more than saying God is merciful, but purely presenting God as love in itself provokes everyone to love it back. If you present that and you reason from that and present that to them, there's a substantial chunk of people who will think, okay, I see your point. So it's not quite so clear cut. And I think that a lot of this view that perhaps pro-choice people, maybe Democrats in America, Labour people, Green Party people, leftists, they are hard-hearted, horrible people, is because many of us, our only interaction with them is watching feminist wrecked compilations and interactions in YouTube comment sections. And while those people do exist, a substantial proportion aren't like that, and they simply don't know anything else. And so if you provide them a good alternative, they'll adapt it.
I think a big part of it is also how we often choose to interact with people. Because when you start to... I know people have called it in these communities kind of cringe, but this idea of red pill poisoning, right? When you lose your ability to socialize with people because you're so incensed at what you found out is going on. Now, if you're talking to somebody who is pro-abortion, the worst thing for you to do is to have some kind of some kind of autistic moment where you demand that they understand everything that you do, and they hold all the same opinions, and they get upset about the same things as you, and so on and so forth. A lot of the time, these things come down to building a personal rapport with people, having them understand that you have principles from which you're speaking that make sense, even if they don't agree with it yet, and so on. It's always a bad idea to go to people and in your interactions with them, basically just express your dissatisfaction with their position. That's not right. And it doesn't help them. It doesn't help you. And in the case of abortion, it certainly doesn't help the children.
Yeah, it's very hard to not do that, especially when you have them posting things like... I don't know how much detail I should go into this. I want to keep this kind of G-rated. But suffice to say, a lot of women are coping so hard with their abortions, they'll have abortion-related tattoos, right? What you've got to understand is not to be horrified, and understandably you would be horrified at it. But this comes out of a tremendous amount of emotional hurt. And granted, knocking them dead with a logical argument often is enough to wake them up. But you have to have compassion and patience with these people, as hard as it is. Like I went through a period of my life where I refused to talk to anybody who had an abortion. Not productive. Doesn't help people. So, aside from that, is there any questions? Here's one. How do I convince my friends not to sleep around? Do you want to talk about that, Hassan?
Yeah, I've had some success with this. Basically, talk to them about the things that already matter to them. So I found this as a good segue into basically getting people to start thinking about religion in general. One of the best things to do is talk to modern men and women about something that they're very concerned about and find lots of problems with. Interpersonal love. Right? Now, absorb their language as well. Like, if you talk to lots of very modern secular people, you'll find that they use phrases like toxic, right? You can reorder these vague terms that don't have very good definitions towards very well-ordered things. For example, if you tell some modern white girl that it's one of the common traits of toxic relationships is that a person thinks that the relationship is supposed to be give and take, and they don't understand that in real love, the giving is the getting. Because that's what it is. In real love,
The reason that you love them is because you give. Now, your continued friendship is not a term of, is not a condition. It's not a term and condition for your love for them. It's that's just a result of reciprocated love. If you want to explain to your friends who've got problems with fornication, then you have to explain, like, okay, if you really care about this person, which I assume you do, or even if you have a general care for them as another human being, why would you cooperate with them in the destruction of their capacity to keep together a long-term relationship later? I mean, keep that in mind. There's good evidence that premarital sex, especially for women, destroys their ability to keep long-term relationships together. You can make a lot of good use for that, right? In conversations with friends. If they're your friends, they'll take what you're saying seriously, because you already have a rapport with them. It's a lot harder with other people. But that's one thing, is the destruction of the lives of the women that they're doing this with, right? And then there's other things that you can use, other than the objective damage to the person that they're doing this to, which is that there is a wider effect of these relationships and the increase in the normalization of the spontaneity of relationships and sexuality in relationships on future generations. And then all you need to do is talk to them about how there'll be lots more children raised by mothers who are between men all the time. There will be a lot more children who are not really wanted by parents that are forced to raise them for child benefits or everything. There are lots of cases like this. Lots and lots and lots of them. And many of these people it'll strike a chord with, because they may have experienced something like this. And it's not fair for us to put many people in future generations through this kind of harm just because we want to experience some kind of pleasure.
I want to say something quickly to anissa dimas, who says that you have to use the softest expressions possible when you present an argument. Anything else is seen as provocation. Often it's not beneficial to do that. Like, sometimes what you have to do is whack them very hard with the truth when you know that you've got them, particularly if you're online. Now, you do this in a compassionate way, but you have to go flat and not compromise the truth ever. But you don't be cruel. It's easy to be cruel.
I agree. It's like evangelization with people. There's some very good books on this, contemporary books on evangelization in the current century. That there's a book called Evangelization in the Third Millennium, which is very good. And you need to think about how, with each person, you have to kind of have this tailor-made medicine. Think of it like that, right? Each person is different, and you have to read how a person is feeling and what they're probably going to abide with in that particular interaction. What's gone on with them recently? What are the ins, right? If they're upset about something, they went through a breakup or something's going on in their family, and they trust you, and it won't be weird or wrong for you to bring it up, then use it as an example, use it as an in to get them thinking, right? This is how you do things. Remember, there's a good book called The Old Evangelization, How to Spread the Gospel the Way Christ Did. He uses questions to force introspection a lot, and he only starts saying things explicitly towards the end. Once, like Elliot said, you've got them. You can say things explicitly because they've already consented to having dug themselves into the hole.
I mean,
sometimes it's not good. Sometimes even when you've cornered them, the best thing to do is to show and be like, okay, enough of this. Let's talk about this again later. And they'll appreciate that because they felt uncomfortable, and they knew that you knew that they felt uncomfortable. And they'll be willing to talk about this again, which is the most important thing. Because you're never going to convert somebody in one interaction.
Although online you can't really do that. I think a lot of the time online it's as beneficial as possible. The most beneficial thing to do is to do a mix of that Socratic reasoning, but also disarm them completely. Because the thing is that you find that the average person doesn't really know much when it comes to philosophical argumentation, let alone, well, really anything pertaining to that realm. So you just disarm them very quickly, you take away their preconceptions and make sure they realise that, and make as much an impression as possible to throw them in a different direction. And then you've done all you can do. So you've got to be aware of that.
We had some good examples of this over the last hour and a half with these pro-abortion women. One of the things that you notice is the moment that they hyper-focus on this word fetus as if there's something special about it, and it makes a child somehow different before they're born as opposed to after. And you just say, what on earth does a change in location have to do with what a thing is? And they don't have anything to say. They have nothing.
Well, not only that, you can point out that fetus is just the Latin synonym for child.
Yeah, it's just Germanic and Latin. You're right. But with these people, like their preconceived notions about this word having any kind of important distinction, or their notions about like birth somehow doing something to the nature of the thing, or even just forcing them to think in terms of nature and accident. It makes them realize that they're not equipped in any way for the actual conversation. All they've been dealing with is rhetoric. Yeah. And ironically, what you've done is shown them that their rhetoric is also terrible.
Well, yeah, you see, for example, one of the prevalent memes in the pro-abortion community that I found is about batter, and how batter has to be baked to be a cake. Now, the trouble is that when you hit this with Thomism, or something like that, well, it becomes clear that the batter is essentially a cake. It just needs to undergo the transformation of the oven to become properly a cake. And all of the other things that you put on top of the cake are merely accidents. So it's not essential to have chocolate or icing on top. And if you present this to them and say, well, actually, yes, the batter is actually the same as the cake, it just needs to undergo the transformation of the oven, then they're a little bit caught off, and they say, well, you wouldn't serve batter to somebody at a cake shop. And it's like, well, yeah, that's where you put it in the oven first. It's necessary for it to be there, but it's not essential to the form of the cake itself.
Well, it's similar to this. Sperm and an egg in the same solution is not a child, but the moment fertilization happens, it's a child. And in the same way, the various ingredients in a bowl is not a cake, but the moment it's been subjected to enough heat for it to gain any of the definitive traits of a cake, it's not just batter anymore, it's the cake.
Well, I would say the batter...
The material...
I disagree. I'd say that the batter in itself is...
Yeah. That's a question of formal cause, though, isn't it? But anyway, I don't get into the weeds. You're what you're saying is still right.
It is essentially the same. Like, you have rational ensoulment at the zygote level, and what I'm saying is that the zygote is equivalent to the batter. It just needs to be baked to develop a full person, but everything that is essentially cake, the essential cakeness is present in the batter. Well, not in the batter materially necessarily, but formally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, oh wait, are you going to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to respond to anissa demos. Anissa demos, you're talking about Aristotle's topics. It's good, but remember the distinction between the wisdom of this world and the wisdom who died for us on a cross. There's Aristotle is very good. Yeah?
He's a philosophical theist, he isn't Christian.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he mentioned it in another chat, and
I would still venture to say that it would be perhaps just a philosophical interest to you then to investigate St. John Chrysostom's writings on the Acts of the Apostles, and his commentaries on that are essentially all about their use of persuasion towards the Jews, and then the other groups that they go speak to. So you may be interested in that because, especially when Luke covers St. Paul's exploits, he definitely shows that there is a very large Hellenic philosophical influence on his style of persuasion, especially in when he goes to the Areopagus to speak to the Athenians.
Well, okay, so
quotes.
Wait, go ahead. Were you finished?
I was just gonna say he actually quotes Greek philosophers in that passage of Acts, and it's not said in Acts that he's quoting philosophers, but John Chrysostom shows where he's quoting people.
Also, I just wanted to say for Anissa Demas's benefit, apropos to what you were saying in the comments on the last stream, if you want to see the parallels of Aristotle's metaphysics with the scriptures, I very strongly recommend you not only read Genesis, but you also go and read Exodus, particularly the part where Moses is speaking to the burning bush. Because when Moses is speaking to the burning bush, 1,000 years before Aristotle's metaphysics was written, you have God declaring himself to be pure act. In other words, the final cause of the universe, as Aristotle makes clear in the Metaphysics.
This is something deeply clear in the Semitic tradition. If you read Philo of Alexandria, you'll see it. He says, I'm not bringing you to Judaism, I'm just expressing it in Hellenic terms.
Yeah, and you have natural theology enabled by St. Paul in Romans chapter 1 as well. So you can see a lot of the philosophical theism of the pagans, like, well, maybe not people like David Hume or Kant, but certainly Aristotle, the Platonists, and, well, maybe not the Pythagoreans, they were pantheists, weren't they? But, like the middle ground Hylomorphists and the Platonists you can see in the Old and New Testaments very easily.
Yeah. Ehye asher ehye. What I am is that I exist.
I am that I am, yeah.
Yeah. But when you render it in English, it almost sounds like a tautology, but the Hebrew brings out like what it, it's very clear that it can't be read any other way than an essentially Aristotelian understanding of what God is.
Oh, High Wraith 1545 asks, have you seen Trent Horn's recent debates with Cosmic Skeptic? If so, what did you think? Well, I watched as much of it to understand that Cosmic Skeptic's primary opposition to Christianity is the suffering of animals. Which, I mean, it's necessary to the existence of animals for there to be pain. Because you see, there are two categories of pain and suffering. There's pena, P-O-E-N-A in Latin, and there's culpa, which is sin. Now, sin is not innate to the world that we live in. That came in through the sin of our first parents, as I'm sure that, whatever his name, I think it's Alex O'Connor or something like that, would know. But pena is, in a certain sense, innate to the human form. However, it disappears in heaven. There is no pain in heaven. And a lot of other things as well there. This is also likewise the case with animals. So, for example, it would be very strange for animals to ignore getting spiked by the thorns of a plant. So, that would be a sign of leprosy or something like that. That would be a sign of a disease. So, for animals not to have that sense of pain would not only compromise their form as animals, but it would also make a lot of God's plan very difficult.
I mean, I think the most important takeaway from it was that Cosmic Skeptic has had his mind open up to an entire domain of arguments in a completely different tradition than he's ever interacted with, which was very good. He realized nothing that he had was even applicable to classical theism.
Yeah,
which is kind of what you were talking about earlier, wasn't it? Right?
Yeah.
About blowing people away by showing them that they're not actually equipped for anything that isn't a rhetorical debate.
Yeah, that's the thing. A lot of them are used to dealing with presuppositionalists.
Yeah,
Also,
and actually, there's a very good paper that was read out and recorded on Mathoma's channel, if anybody wants to check it out, on a refutation of presup by a Protestant author, and it's pretty good.
I looked into some volumes dedicated to the philosophy in late antiquity, and I was a little surprised to see the names of Maximus the Confessor and Gregory of Nyssa. Yeah, they're incredibly important.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also Justin Martyr, Saint Justin Martyr, if you want to see the Middle Platonist aspect of Christianity, that would be a good person to look into. Clement of Alexandria, I know you're very keen on. Hassan?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're very keen on him.
Yeah, I mean, Maximus the Confessor, if I could quickly give an overview on why he's important, if that's all right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Maximus the Confessor basically he's the first patristician who is a patristic author himself. He's the first one who goes through all the previous fathers and finds that which is essential, that which they all agree upon, those things which the church ratifies, and so on and so forth, and so manages to bring together all of the previous fathers into a cohesive, not comprehensive, but cohesive view. And this is when you start to see this idea of the cosmic Christ as Logos really come into fruition in Christian theology. And it's fascinating. And I believe Balthasar and a lot of other recent Catholic philosophers have written very much on Maximus the Confessor, and he's certainly worth looking more into for somebody who is interested in philosophy for its own sake.
Okay, Hyrith 1545 says, can't the problem of animal suffering be also solved by saying animals aren't moral agents, that they are NPCs for the use of humans like plants? Well, no, because you see, the reason why suffering is justified for man is because he develops in virtue through this. Animals don't have such a thing.
Yeah, also this it doesn't really hold because we have in our own tradition the necessity of mercy for plants and animals. So if human beings are expected to be merciful towards other created life, then it's unconscionable that God doesn't will this when we're expected to hold to this.
Why didn't I think of that?
Furthermore, remember, furthermore, there's something very important that needs to be kept in mind. Christ is incarnate, not simply inhominate. Right? He is God becoming flesh through becoming man. The only way that it would be fitting for God to redeem creation through his becoming flesh would be to do so without becoming something that is not rational. And so man, in a sense, is created so that God can dwell more fittingly in creation through the incarnation. This is the concept of deep incarnation. It's worth reading into a bit more, but essentially this is the philosophy and the theology behind the Holy Father's writings, Laudato Si and Querida Amazonia, and a couple of other things written about integral ecology in the Catholic theology.
Yeah, you see, related to that, I didn't actually think of that, because I'll make an admission. I held an error, and I repented of it in confession today. I thought there was pain in heaven, but there isn't. But now that the fact that you mentioned that animal pain might exist to the end of helping man's kindness, and reminding him of his responsibility to look after animals, I'd never actually thought of that.
Yeah, I mean, just yesterday, the boys and I were doing a Lectio, and something that we noticed was that St. Paul and the Psalms, when you bring them together, say that love of God's righteousness and justice, love of God's kindness and goodness, which exist in all things, because things only exist insofar as they have goodness, and any privation is not the thing itself, but a reduction of it. Therefore, everything that exists is God's goodness, but we only truly know this when we have an intimate knowledge or personal relation with God. We only have the ability to truly appreciate the natures that God has created of all things in this world through our relationship with Him. And so, the existence of animals and plants and so on, for us to actually have love for, is essentially God creating more things for us to have the relation of virtue with, and so therefore for us to participate with God in. Because all virtues are relational things which are in us finite reflections of how we signify God in different ways. We signify God by referring to wisdom, to knowledge, to love, to all these different things. And the human self grows in virtue by having interactions and relations with things within this universe according to those different modes of signification of God, which are the virtues. You can't have virtue in a way that's entirely bound up within yourself. Virtue for a created being is a relation with God, and through that, a relation with all creations, which God loves. As I was saying.
Well, insofar as they're theological virtues, but surely natural virtues are applied to creatures, which therefore relate to God through their sustaining by God.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Virtue in that sense is virtue in the sense of a thing being good for what it is. The Aristotelian concept, right?
Yeah. Okay, let's choose something a little bit more like different from that. Because there's been a bunch of questions. I'm going to scroll up a little bit and see if there are any. We'll go for this one from Thomas. Is it possible to judge others guilty of sins objectively, judging insofar as their exterior actions but not their interior dispositions or their culpability of said evil action? Now, Aquinas said, well, there was 3 specific things that you need to know the internals of a person and be able to judge them. Now, the only persons that possess the ability to do that are Father, Son, and Holy Spirit by their nature. So you're not allowed to judge at all. Now, obviously, that means like putting someone down and beneath yourself by virtue of that. However, can you recognise sin? Of course. Just don't let it taint your view of the person. And I seem to recall, I don't know if it was St. Paul, I think it was St. Paul said this in the Epistle to the Romans. He said that insofar as you recognise the sin in your brother, you're responsible for it yourself, because like knows like. And that's a reference to the posterior analytics that I've just thrown in there.
Mm-hmm.
So the key is to not judge, and I find it very hard because I'm an arrogant person. But it's something that you need, because the first sin was pride, and for that single sin, Satan was cast into hell. How much more so would you be cast into hell if a cherubim like Satan was cast into hell? How much more so would it be for you?
Yeah, I mean, we need to recognize sin in others the way that we recognize that a person is having an aneurysm, basically.
Yeah, you've got to remember, I seem to recall it was probably Father Chad Ripperger who was referring to one of the Democrat politicians who said, like, we're tired of your facts, we want the truth, right? I mean, they're, of course, identical statements. You have to realise that we live in a society, well, actually, we don't live in a society, we live in an order, where people are not cognizant of that order. And so we have to have compassion when we are tempted to judge others, and particularly we should remember our own faults. Cardinal Cajetan, in his book Humility of Heart, at the beginning, in the introduction, I don't think Cajetan himself actually wrote this, but he tells us that when we are tempted to judge somebody else, that we are to remember the 7 cardinal vices and 4 other vices that are not capital even. I think they're specifically cruelty, ignorance, and then there's 2 others I can't remember. If we are tempted to judge our brother, regardless of who they are, we should recall whenever we have sinned in those categories and reckon what we are in relation to that as somebody who is but dust and ash, and as somebody who is nonetheless completely worthy of God's love, but likewise so are they. So, I don't know what you want to say on that, Hassan.
No, I think that pretty much wraps it up. I wanted to comment on what Nicodemus has to say about Pseudo Dionysius.
I figured you might.
I'm not going to defend it here, but I take the traditional view of its authorship as actually being Dionysius the Areopagite. I know that there are things that seem to come from Proclus. I know. I don't care. there's good arguments. I'm sure if you do some research into the traditional, those who hold the traditional argument among scholarship today, you'll find some interesting things. I'm not sure who Dimas is, but in respect to interesting Christian authors worth reading for somebody who is a philosophical theist, I think that The Fount of Knowledge by Yahya Damascus or John of Damascus is definitely worth reading. It's essentially the first Christian scholastic manual and it was written hundreds of years before Thomas Aquinas.
Sorry, I'm just responding to a comment. Actually, someone asked about, talking of systematic theology, thoughts on Origen. Well, he held a lot of cringe beliefs, but he was important.
Yeah, he had some cringe beliefs. It's not agreed upon whether or not he can be accused of being in the sin of heresy. There is a very good argument that he isn't guilty of much of what people believe he is, and there is even an important there is even a view that importantly he doesn't believe some of the things that he was believed to have believed on closer examination of his work. I think he did believe most of those things. I think he did believe in apokatastasis. I don't believe that he castrated himself. There are many different things to consider, but in any case, the church didn't canonize him. I think that his work is very important, and for somebody who is attempting a scholarly view of the patristic era, of that particular phase of the patristic era, to understand the Cappadocian Fathers, it is definitely worth reading Origen. If you want to understand Gregory of Nyssa and so on, you need to understand the rest of the context. And Origen is, of course, very important in the transmission of the scripture. And so he's definitely worth reading for that purpose.
You also have to remember that a lot of the homilies that we have for Origen are translations by Rufinus, who was somebody who was known for heterodox views. So you have to remember that the translation might be influenced there. I know that you could probably get a better idea if you read Contra Rufinus by Saint Jerome, but I can't speak specifically to Rufinus's views myself. Let's see. Are there any questions? There was thoughts on Hegel and Heidegger. I don't have any particular opinion on Heidegger because I don't know, but I know that Hegel's belief in pure spirit is very strange, and I don't agree with it. He was a monist, wasn't he? He was like an idealist monist.
Kind of. He had some very weird views on the Trinity.
Yeah. Not someone you want to get your theology from.
Yeah, he thought that the opposition of relation between the Father and the Son meant a dialectic. And then obviously you have Feuerbach who goes, hey, you can bypass this whole Trinity thing and just, look, the dialectic is clearly like a prior reality. Oh dear.
Are the originals of Origen's writings available to us still? As far as I know, they're not, but we do have Rufinus's translation of them into Latin.
Yeah.
Man, there's all sorts of weird stuff. Like, I'm just looking at what the Sabians and the Brethrens of Purity. That stuff's all very strange.
Yeah, and Dennis, I would argue that our mediation of the Father through Christ's human nature is a type of theology. I would also argue that our requesting the intercession of saints is a type of theology.
Yeah, homilies. Yeah, I do mean his homilies, Gilchrist. We don't actually have, as far as I know, any of Origen's actual manuscripts in the original Greek. Let's see. Their anger is against... Oh, I see. Back to the abortion thing. Their anger against the paternal is part of the problem tied up with sacrificing children. Well, yeah. You just need to get them to stop doing it. Like, you don't have to like change your mind for them. You just have to be compassionate with them. But yeah, I understand the anger completely. Right, are there any other questions?
Someone asked me a question earlier about how I intended to raise my children in Britain. Franco Machado. I'm not sure if you're still here, but if you might have heard, but I chose Alfred the Great as my own confirmation and baptismal saint, and I am somebody who is very much invested in the Catholic period of the Anglo-Saxon people. I'm planning to maybe even specialize in something to do with that at master's level. I've been somebody who reads into the Anglo-Saxon fathers and the other British fathers among those who are recorded in the patrologia. And I would like to incorporate as much of their teaching and their spirituality into my life and therefore into my family life in the future as possible. That's the Anglo influence that I'm willing to give to my children. But our lineage and our identity is always going to be my lineage. I'm not going to pass over who I am and what I am just because of where I live.
Yeah. So this will be a long question. Jonathan Nathan, thoughts on Molinism? Also, favorite modern theologian. So this is how I understand Molinism to be. Actually, I'll answer the modern Catholic theologian question first. Probably Scott Hahn. I just like him. He seems like a really nice person, and his books are good. In terms of Molinism is essentially where graces are presented in front of you and you decide to pick them. And then by following this sort of... I think Father Chad Ripperger described it as a daisy chain of, graces. You pick them up and then you get to heaven from that. Now, St. Alphonsus Liguori condemned Molinos, but I'm not sure if it's specifically for that view. But I have problems with it because you need to have the grace to pick up the grace in the first place. Now, you can correspond with that grace. You can receive it, but you can also reject it. But you still have to have God. God still has to permit you to grab the grace. You don't just grab it of your own free will, because God sustains your entire existence.
You ever spoken to Kento about predestination?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, he's very good on this. He's a very Augustinian kind of guy, and his view is actually the position of the church. Basically, what we're supposed to hold is premotion, the grace of premotion. So, let's say I move my hand towards this mug on my table, and my hand precisely closes around it, and I lift it up. How much of that was directly written for me by God? All of it.
Yeah, exactly.
The only thing that wasn't directly written for me is when there is that involves a privation of the predestination that God has set for it. The human will is something which in itself is pre-moved in the sense that the will exists because God actualizes it, and everything that the will does is also pre-moved by God, but we have the ability in us to either align with that predestiny or to reject it. And basically, every single thing that we do is some deformity of what God intended it to be.
Well, yeah, whenever we sin, we're departing from the plan.
Right.
So, I mean, I have a problem with Molinism for the reasons that I've set out, but I essentially agree with Hassan. I don't know specifically about Kendo, but I'm just going off of what I've heard off of Father Ripperger. So, yeah, I should probably get more sources than Father Ripperger on these sorts of things.
I would recommend, if somebody wants to know about this in detail, pick up Denzinger's Enchiridion and read what the Council of Orange says about semi-Pelagianism. Check the other things that it says about grace and predestination. Frankly, I don't think it's a very good idea to get very deep into the Molinist controversy in a public place like this, because lots of people, even if we describe it perfectly, won't really fully understand what we're saying. And
well, I mean, the church stopped the discussion.
These are issues that can mislead people and send people down rabbit holes and send them insane.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, the church stomped down on it for a reason.
So, yeah. And the thing is that this issue of grace and the particular specifications of predestination and so on, this is an issue that is still being worked out by the church's actual theologians. And it's something which has caused even many of them to basically go insane. Like people who say that there is no distinction between natural and supernatural, and
Oof.
people who deny papal infallibility for various reasons. People who deny the bodily resurrection, even of Christ, and claim that it was a manifestation of the faith of the promise of Christ to the apostles. There's all sorts of stuff, and you have to be very careful. I would definitely recommend that our role is not to get very deep into this stuff. I know you've been saying this recently about theology, but this is way above our station and frankly completely irrelevant to what we have to, our mission basically, and what we have to deal with. Unless there's any people here who God has called to be theologians, in which case Godspeed, but this isn't the place to talk
Well, you see, I know I'm not called specific. I'm pretty certain I'm not called to be one of those like ridiculously detailed theologians, because the thing is that you could get into massive debates about grace and end up as either John Calvin or some other strange view. But the trouble is that to hold those views contradicts the history, and I think that the history speaks for itself. I take primacy in the view of history over any particular theological view or argument, because I believe that although arguments are important, ultimately the reality of the history is far more important, because that's how God manifests his plan. And it's very clear, like I'm actually thinking of doing a stream in a couple of days responding to something by Genetically Modified Skeptic, because he's talking about the history of Christianity, and he talks about the existence of the Gnostics, and like he doesn't state them explicitly, but the Ebionites and others. And he's like, well, how do I decide between all these things? And then never actually answers the question, and just sort of nays on the quote-unquote proto-orthodox or the church fathers, without really giving it any thought. When this question is solved very easily by these church fathers in their own writings. The first question is, what authority? What authority does this particular person have? And because Protestantism, atheism, that was a Freudian slip. Because, well, yeah, I've heard some people say that Protestants call Catholics Mary worshippers because they hold Christ in the same position as we hold Mary.
Yeah, but they're incapable of latria, so they get freaked out by dulia being given to other than God.
Yeah. So, I mean, you could argue that from the fact that the supernatural faith is mere opinion, according to Aquinas, right? But where was I going with this? The first question that these people ask is who did it, right? They ask whose authority, and what Irenaeus does is he goes, okay, sure, here we go. We run down from the apostles. And here are the successors for the various sees, including Rome. This is how it ties to Christ. And we know that Christ is God incarnate because of the prophets. Right? Anything else that goes besides this system isn't something that's verified, is something that I just immediately throw out. Because I know for a fact that I can be deceived with logical argument. The last 300 years have been the deceptions of different syllogisms. There are so many different syllogisms in the Enlightenment philosophers that are ridiculous. For instance, David Hume sets out in his philosophy that we cannot perceive causation and it's merely a mental trick. Well, you say he may well make it like a seemingly valid argument, but the trouble is that in other places he denies miracles, which are because they defy the natural law. Now, in order to derive the natural law, you must have a conception of causation, because causation proceeds from those very laws, and to discern those laws we must study the causation and the interaction between different objects. There's one contradiction, and it's also contradicted by history. The numerous instances of Eucharistic miracles, the stigmatist saints, the saints that levitate, and many others. We know that these things exist, but nonetheless, you can have a syllogism for anything and everything. But the real interesting part is when you start attacking the axioms of the argument. That's where the real fight is won. And a lot of that comes from history. So that's why I like to focus on history. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I have a thought. How come there's 51 people watching, but only 25 of you have pressed like?
Smash that like button! Okay, real final question, because I know you've got to go off and pray in a minute. Do you want to...
Yeah.
What's your opinion on Kant's moral philosophy? Well, the trouble... I think he's speaking of categorical imperatives and deontology, right? Reality doesn't really work that way. You have the principle of double effect, and you will... if you hold a purely deontological view, you'll be forced to inaction in a lot of circumstances, right? Because you will have instances where you will have to buy from the shop that supports abortion, for example. And pure deontology, I have never read specifically Kant. I have enough problems with his view of knowing things that I know that I don't want to. But if you were to take it purely on moral principle and that's it, you would starve to death. Which is obviously the privation of the greater good of your life. And so you have to have things like the principle of double effect. Veritatis Splendor is a document that I've been recommended. I haven't actually gone through it yet properly. But that would be a good start on looking into alternative ethical systems. Hey,
who pressed dislike? Am I rude? Rude.
Andy.
Come on.
Guilting me like that is not Christian. I still smash that like button.
Well, I'm not even the guy who runs the channel, so don't hold it against him if I tell you that you have to like the video. Very rude.
Okay, so I think we're going to bring it to a close unless you want to say something about Kant.
No, honestly, like Kant. Oh, I don't know about that one, Chief.
It's very arcane stuff to actually get into Kant and fully understand what he's saying, and it's very deceptive. You can think you understand him, then read another thing and realize that the last 3 things you read you didn't actually understand. I don't think it's worth it for normal people, and he's not really relevant anymore anyway, so forget about it.
Well, I mean, I have this principle where anybody that says that I can't know something in its absolute with the exception of God, I think that's ridiculous. So, I'm just going to dismiss everything you said.
Yeah, but what does he mean by absolute? He's a weird guy. It's difficult to know if that's actually what you think that he means is what he actually means. That's one of the problems with him.
You see, I think that there's a problem in philosophy where it's strange because nowadays you don't really look at philosophers' lives, do you? But during the times of the Greeks, the lives of the philosophers were very important because they lived their principles. And, I mean, obviously the greatest philosopher, because he was the philanthropos, Christ. You can see in his perfect life the perfect philosophy. And then other philosophers besides that, vary in different ways. And although I know it's the genetic fallacy in the extreme, I do think that it's a good way of getting a rough idea.
Yeah, I mean, when people say, why didn't Christ write a book of philosophy, I default to what St. Fulton Sheen says when he says, why would Sophia himself write something about love for himself? And secondly, Christ, who is the person of wisdom, showed himself to us, because when a man writes books, it often becomes that his books are remembered more than him. Books were written about Christ. We have no choice but to interact with his person.
Well, yeah, not only that. Also, Isidore, I think it is because if I were to judge someone's philosophical views based on their life, then you'd have a lot of problems with good people living very difficult lives. So, what I would say... Where was I going to go with this? Where was I going to go with this? I don't know. Either way, I think we've run out of questions. I'm going to bring it to a close. I know you have to go pray, so thanks everyone for watching. And the day after tomorrow, we'll be responding to the genetically modified skeptic. If you want, actually, you know what? I'll mention that on the stream. I was going to say go and let him know that I'm streaming to him, but actually, yeah, you can do that through Twitter if you have Twitter. I'd appreciate it. Anyway. Thanks very much, and I'll see you guys later. and goodbye.
Yeah, God bless.
God bless.